Hello, I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question. In this half-hour podcast series from the Centre for Independent Studies, we explore questions and challenges to liberalism today. My guest today is Hannes Gissurarson, Professor of Politics at the University of Iceland and Director of Research at RNH, which is the Icelandic Research Centre for Innovation and Economic Growth. He is a learned man, been on governing boards of banks, visiting scholars in America, holds a D.Phil in politics, and also once ran a pirate radio station. Welcome, Hannes.
Well, I'm delighted that you're having me.
Well, let's start with the most important part of your CV, the pirate radio station, if you don't mind. What's the pirate radio station got to do with liberalism? And I notice you mentioned in your introduction to your excellent 2-volume book, 24 Conservative Liberal Thinkers, that the medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas was also when you're thinking about the radio station. Can you bring them all together for us?
Yes, I claimed St. Thomas Aquinas as an ally. And the reason he is my ally is that basically he argued that the natural law applied to kings as well as to the population, to the people. And there was, even if he was a cautious and moderate conservative, there was a right of rebellion if you thought that the law was unjust. It wasn't really for the public good. And in Iceland, we had a situation for many years where we had a government monopoly of broadcasting, and I felt that that was unjust. But probably a rebellion against it was not justifiable under St. Thomas Aquinas' principles unless there were special situations. And the special situation that arose in the autumn of 1984 was that the newspapers men had gone on strike, and so had the radio people. So there were no media in Iceland, and I and a few of my friends, we started a pirate radio station just to abrogate this, just to make news available to the population. Basically, everything had been turned off by the strikers. And what happened was that the police chased us for 8 days, and they finally closed the radio station. But we enjoyed widespread sympathy with the population, and it was actually agreed the next year that the government monopoly of broadcasting was abolished. So this was a successful political action in the spirit of St. Thomas Aquinas.
And an application of what you call conservative liberalism, which is your theme in your book and your work. How is that an application of conservative liberalism, running a pirate radio station against a government monopoly?
Well, what we have to do is to limit the power of government, to work against the public good. And I would actually use 3 catchwords to describe conservative liberalism. It would be free trade, private property, and limited government. And it was limited government that we wanted. We didn't want the government really to have a monopoly on what we could do or say on the airwaves. And we thought it was something that was a fluke, that was something out of the ordinary. If we were going to have a freedom of the press, then we should also have the freedom of the airwaves. That was our view in Iceland. Yes.
Now, you write that you don't regard liberalism, and you can ask firstly, you've put the word conservative in front of the word liberalism. Explain why that word's there.
Yes, because there are actually types of conservatism that are not liberal, and there are also types of liberalism that are not conservative. What I tried to do was to define a special political position that I identify, and I think is shared by people like David Hume and others, and most profoundly by Friedrich Hayek, because Friedrich Hayek's great question is, why is it that we, despite individual ignorance, are able to achieve so much with our culture? And his answer briefly is that it is because we avail ourselves of a system of private property rights and free trade and the price mechanism, but also of traditions, conventions, and mores. So it follows from his whole theoretical framework, both actually great support of free trade and private property, and also respect for traditions and the intermediary institutions that soften the grip of power on us. What we have to do, and this is really Hayek's great contribution, is to realize that the dispersal of knowledge requires the dispersal of power and decisions. So that devolution, decentralization.
And in fact, as I understand him, if you centralize knowledge, you don't know as much to run things properly. It can't be done. It can't be done.
You have to decentralize power because knowledge by its nature is decentralized, because a lot of it is personal knowledge or knowledge of time and place. Take, for example, skills. They're extremely uneven. Some people have skills in one thing and some other people have skills in other things. The knowledge how to do things, and they can't be taken into or accumulated in a computer and used to make central decisions. And this is basically his refinement and reinforcement of Ludwig von Mises's argument against socialism. Already in 1920, as I tell it in the story in my book, Ludwig von Mises had given a paper in Vienna where he had explained that basically socialism was unable to achieve its goals because they couldn't make the correct calculations. And what Hayek did was to take this argument, which is correct in its own proper place, and make it into a much more general argument against centralization of decisions.
Against centralization. I read somewhere recently that one of the problems with this kind of thinking, Hayek and the many others in your book, is that we grow up thinking that the best way things are changed is by making decisions top down. We control things. And yet Hayek and others are saying that, in fact, when you get to a society, that doesn't work. In fact, there needs to be a kind of, I'm not sure it's quite the right word, spontaneous order, a spontaneous order that occurs when people make decisions based upon their own smaller area together, and the whole thing grows. This is, in a sense, it doesn't seem natural at first. It's somewhat counterintuitive, and therefore it needs to be explained. Am I making sense?
Yes, you are. And let me put it a little bit differently. People have traditionally spoken about the two things that will drive us further. One is the stick, and the other one is the carrot. That is to say, the fear of loss and the hope for profit. But this is not enough.
Yep.
This is not enough.
The stick or the carrot? Not okay. Yes. Yep.
The stick and the carrot. This is not enough because we have to know in which direction to run. And that is where the signal comes in. And this is precisely Hayek's contribution. We all knew that we would run faster if we had a carrot in front of us and a stick behind us. Of course, yes, but we have to know where to go. And we can only do that if we get the necessary information through the price mechanism and through traditional morality. That is basically the argument.
So the two things are, they seem so different to it, don't they? The price mechanism, which is what people will pay for this good or service or product, and traditional morality, which is, in a sense, a very different kind of thing. You're bringing together God and mammon.
Well, actually, yes, you're absolutely right that there is a tension between the two, because most people, they need a foreseeable, firm foundation and predictability and continuity in their life. No question about that. But on the other hand, we also need the creative destruction of capitalism, innovation, entrepreneurs that upset equilibria. So we need both of them, and there is always within conservative liberalism a tension. But this is what makes it both fruitful and persuasive, because we really don't want to live in a society which has no innovations and is just has no change, but we do not want to live either in a society where everything is in a flux and you can't really predict the behavior of others and there is no continuity. So, and one other thing about all this is we must never neglect the civil society. Conservative liberalism believes that there is not only the free market, as good as it is, but also civil society with all the little platoons that
Yes.
Burke spoke about, all the associations and and other entities. Burke actually thought that traditional morality involved monarchy, as you have in Australia, and
it's a long way away from us in Australia. In practice, we're not a monarchy, but we are. Yes,
I know, but I think actually in some countries monarchy is like the gold standard. It really works because it instills respect in people. For
No, I can see that.
If you have a coin made of gold, you respect the currency.
Yep.
If you have a monarch, then it is much more of a glory to go to get a medal in a palace from somebody who's a representative of a family that has been there for 1,000 years. So I believe that the argument for monarchy, tongue-in-cheek, obviously, is that the elected politicians, the battle-scarred politicians, they shouldn't get all the glory that may stem from a state that has been around for 1,000 years.
Yes. So liberalism alone by itself, you're saying, can become destructive in the sense that it tears down, it attacks those intervening institutions. I mean, there's that marvelous, Marx, I think, got a lot of success because he was such a brilliant writer. Well, I'm not sure he's a great thinker, but all that vanishes turns into air. He described the complete commercialization of society where nothing but the dollar counted. And this would destroy, he thought, would destroy all other institutions. And you're saying that that is true, but we have to have conservatism to stop it, or that true liberalism doesn't do that because true liberalism must involve traditions as well and not just be pure economics?
Well, I think actually that what happens is that capitalism destroys some things, as Marx describes, and Tocqueville had the same worries, many others. Surely that's correct, but we must also understand the great self-corrective powers of a free civilization. Let me just put it this way. Shakespeare, he was an individualist because Romeo and Juliet, they were individuals who stepped out of the traditional roles as members of the Capulet and Montague families. But, under normal circumstances, they would have formed a new family. So it wasn't only a rebellion against the old family, it would have been the foundation of a new family. And this is what happens under capitalism. You may break up a miners' village in Wales because it has become uneconomic, or a farmer's village in the Alps. But people move to cities, and there they form new associations and communities. And what is essential is to facilitate the formation of new associations and moralities and groups and informal social monitoring, at the same time as we provide continuity. So essentially what this is evolution instead of revolution. What we have to do is to facilitate that people can implement their little dreams, each in their own little corner, but that we should not impose any one dream on society, because if you try to do that, an intellectual stream of reconstructing society, then you will end up with a nightmare, as you saw under socialism in China and Russia.
I was going to ask you the alternative to conservative liberalism, the great opponent of conservative liberalism, is the belief that the world can be made better by top-down planning by the really fine experts. And this is still an attractive option for people in their mind, that it can be solved by this top-down leadership. Why do you think that is so attractive still? If conservative liberalism is self-correcting and works better, why are there so many people who don't believe in it?
Well, I think actually they are essentially intellectuals who believe in reconstructing society. Yes. The ordinary man is faithful to capitalism. Everybody who is sort of an ordinary person wants to go to a more free country, from North Korea to South Korea, from Mexico to Texas, and from Venezuela to Florida. So if given the choice, the ordinary men and women, they want to go to capitalism and out of socialism. But I wanted to emphasize, though, that nevertheless, material well-being is only one facet of conservative liberalism. We shouldn't belittle it at all. But man is more than a maximizing machine. Man is a choosing agent who has aspirations. And the utilitarian approach and the economic approach to economic affairs, it may be good at telling us how many coins we'll have in the pocket, but it can't tell us. It can tell us what we can have, but it can't tell us what we are or want to be, what are our aspirations, and so on. So I think that economics tell us about the constraints that our choices are subject to, but they can't choose for us because we are choosing agents ourselves.
In your book, two volume, you talk about a tradition traced back to the medieval idea that government is to be by consent and not by power. In a way, that's so obvious to us, we think today, we forget that was not obvious for many people, for many parts of life, and still not with the world today.
Quite so, and that actually fits in nicely with your contrast between the top-down and the down-top thing.
Yeah.
Snorri Sturluson, for example, he was a great spokesman of the Icelandic chronicler of the old legal tradition, which was that customary law was more or less developed by consensus, by the wise old man who knew the law. And then Aquinas came with natural law, and both of them thought in terms of constraints of government. And I think that's an essential feature of conservative liberalism. It is not really, well, it is both optimistic and pessimistic. It is pessimistic like conservatism in that we recognize that each individual has very little knowledge, including the intellectuals who are offering to govern us. Everybody has little knowledge. But what we can do is to join together and enjoy and accumulate social capital, as some people have called it, the moral capital. And that has been done in the West. And I include, of course, Australia and New Zealand as parts of this Western tradition that I'm talking about. We can avail ourselves of thousands of years of experience, of the wisdom of our ancestors and so on. But that is also to be subject to revision, obviously. We will reject some traditions, but we will create others. So, yes, capitalism is destructive, but it is at the same time creative, especially freedom. The only remedy to freedom is more freedom.
More freedom, and you're convinced that history shows that this actually is the method by which humans flourish. Freedom is the main by which people flourish. You think that can be shown historically?
I think actually a case can be made for artists and others having rendered a lot of service to kings and popes in the past. Yep. But on the whole, I think that individuals, they flourish the best when they are free to experiment and innovate, or just to, as Oakeshott would say, enjoy themselves in their narrow circle of friends and family, and being playful, doing all kinds of things for their own sake and not simply in order to collect more money.
Now, it's interesting, you start in medieval Europe, and not all, but most of your figures are European, or at least European background. In fact, towards the end of your introduction, you say that you emphasize that these 25 very different people, covering a long, very different philosophers, theologians, economists, prime ministers, novelists, in one or two cases, they all talk about the value of choice, and you say, which is a commitment to, indeed, a celebration of Judeo-Christian Western civilization. And conservatism, as you say, is the self-consciousness of Western civilization. I think you've shown that from my point of view. Does this mean that conservative liberalism is inevitably tied up with the West?
I actually discussed this in the chapter on Hayek, and I refer there to a discussion that I had in Sydney in Australia.
Yep.
With two distinguished scholars from whom I learned a lot. And I would consider them to be liberal conservatives, whereas I was a conservative liberal. They were Kenneth Minogue, and my supervisor at Oxford, John Gray. And what I basically argued there was that even if freedom is more of a skill than an object or anything like that, an aim, it's more of a skill, it's a product of our civilization rather than something that we can look forward to. Even if that's true, in principle, liberty can be enjoyed by all human beings. So everybody is fit for freedom. Whereas I think that some of the conservatives who are not liberals as well, they think that this is just a product of the West and cannot be enjoyed by anyone else. What I am not advocating at all is liberal imperialism, so that we would just impose our values on other societies. They have to choose them themselves if choice is relevant as a criterion for them. But basically, I think that freedom is a universal value, but that it came into being and was developed in the West as a result of a Judeo-Christian civilization. And this is, of course, a consciously Hegelian approach to say that conservative liberalism is the self-consciousness of Western civilization, because Hegel, of course, taught that freedom was the Weltgeist, or the world spirit.
The world spirit, yes.
Coming conscious of himself.
You're not buying Hegel. You're not Hegelian, though, are you? I hope.
No, I did not include Hegel or John Stuart Mill in the book.
That was interesting. That both were not there, actually.
Yes.
Mill is often appealed to. Yes.
Hegel was too much of an authoritarian, although you could actually provide a liberal interpretation of Hegel. And Mill, even if Mill was also in many ways a liberal, he was definitely more of a radical liberal and a romantic individualist who rejected a lot of traditions that I find necessary for the maintenance and stability and continuity of our society. And in his last years, he dabbled in socialism, obviously.
How important is the Judeo-Christian part of Western civilization? Do you think liberalism is grounded fundamentally, in the past anyway, in a religious worldview?
Well, if it is true, which I argue in the book, that basically liberalism is the extension of the moral vision to the whole of mankind, then I think that can be rooted in the Christian notion of everybody having a soul and everybody being a child of God and everybody being cast in the image of God. Because for God, everybody is equal, white and black, man and woman, rich and poor. That's basically the idea. The extension of the moral vision to the whole of mankind. And that is a Christian notion, I would think. I would like to add that you can be an atheist and a very good conservative liberal.
Oh, yes, no, my question wasn't about that. It was really asking the question, if it came from that was born in that context, that cradle, will conservative liberalism survive if it's cut off from its religious roots? Does it have a life of its own? Because in many of the Western countries, and I'm sure it's the same, I don't know what things are like in Iceland, where you are, there's been a very significant decline in the power or influence of the Christian religion.
Yes, I think that basically religion may not be crucial or indispensable. It's more a traditional morality. And you see, for example, both the Japanese and the old Romans, they were not particularly religious, but they had a strong traditional morality. So I think that civil society is based on the family, on property, and on some kind of shared morality that makes your behavior predictable and provides for continuity. So I would say not necessarily religion, but something that you take for granted.
Yes, although I'm no expert on either Romans or the Japanese, but I know that classical society was not one believed in the equality of people. Very much not so. That was brought in by the Christian Revolution, I believe.
Quite, but that's a particular kind of equality. It's equality before the law, not equality of outcomes.
The Romans did not believe in equal dignity in the way that we do today.
Yes, equal humanhood, humanity. It was the old Catholic conception of universitas hominum, which I learned at school when I was a kid.
I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is the Liberalism in Question. My guest today is Hannes Gissurarson from the University of Iceland. He's speaking to me from Iceland, as a matter of fact, where it's... is Iceland, by the way, this is totally irrelevant to our conversation, is it always icy in Iceland?
Not at all.
Good, because
Iceland is relatively green, and Greenland is relatively white. These are both misnomers, and we had this wonderful idea to give this name to the country so we would be left alone by the rest of the world. And so we have been, because we have been an isolated outpost and for 1,000 years.
And there is a special contribution of Icelanders to conservative liberalism. You have a special contribution, you say.
Well, I think that, for example, the system of fisheries, surprisingly,
Fisheries.
is a good example of the extension of private property rights to a new resource, because essentially we have in Iceland and actually also New Zealand and to some extent in Australia a system of individual transferable quotas, and they are or can be regarded as private property rights to the fish stocks, and that was absolutely necessary, because if you have a limited resource, you have to have limited access to the resource, otherwise it will be overutilized. This is well known.
Yes, the tragedy of the commons.
Yes, quite so, quite so.
Can I ask you, pull back a little to a bigger question? What are the threats to conservative liberalism today that you see in the world?
I think there are three threats that I see which are imminent. One of them may be more of a nuisance than a danger, and that is Islamic fundamentalism. I think that perhaps it is overestimated. I think it can be easily dealt with. Then there is China and Russia. These countries, they reject Western individualism, freedom of choice, not really private property. It is true that capitalism is the only game in town, and the the rulers of those two countries, they recognize that, but they are aggressive, especially China. China has changed her role over the last 15 years, has become much more aggressive than it used to be, militant and building up a strong military, and it's a very powerful country. So this is a threat. Like in some ways there were threats from totalitarian regimes between the wars. Then the third threat is really the threat, internal threat from the woke culture and cancel culture, where people are being deprived of freedom of speech. And the academy and the media have been largely taken over by left-wingers, because we have to realize that Marx is dead, and Marxism was killed by its implementation in Russia and China, but the Marxists in the West, they are still alive, and they teach at universities and in children's schools and so on, and people are now seeing, I think, the results of the domination of the left-wing intellectuals in education.
How are they a threat to the notion of consent in government, of freedom of property, free trade? What's the nature of their threat? I can understand totalitarian superpowers. I can understand a politicized religion. Tell us more about what you think the danger is from within, and why it is such a danger, if it is.
Yeah, yes, I can do that. Basically, it's now thought that corporations shouldn't aim at profit. They should be heavily taxed. This will stifle entrepreneurship and wealth creation. And it still remains to be seen whether the great easing of monetary restraint will result in inflation, which will be very distorting to the economy. But then obviously we see in universities and in the media censorship, self-censorship, and other kinds of censorship, which is very worrying. In my own university, in a decent civilized society, almost everybody is a social democrat. There is no questioning. There is no awareness of individual responsibility for your activities, and there is no. You are looked upon, or the ordinary man is looked upon as a patient, not as an agent, not as somebody who is responsible for his or her actions. And there is nobody who speaks in the media for the taxpayer, for the consumer. It's only those who spend money who are there, and they could do well by reading the very lively writings of William Graham Sumner, to whom I devote a chapter in my book. He discusses the forgotten man, and the forgotten man is the man who always has to pay the bill, and he has been even more forgotten now than he has been in the past.
This, reading your book reminds me of a kind of, I don't know if it's fair to put it, there was a high moment in which conservative liberal ideas had a strong following, at least in the West. I'm not talking about the West here, when Friedman, Reagan, I don't know if I can count Reagan, but Thatcher, there's somewhat controversial figures, but one felt there was a drift. Hayek, there was a drift after the war in the 70s and 80s. What's changed that now seems to have faded? Do we need, yes, my second question will be, and if it has, what's needed to return back to what you believe should be happening? Firstly, what happened?
Well, I think actually that the demise of what people call neoliberalism has been exaggerated. If we look, for example, at the financial crisis of 2008 to 9, then essentially, I think it can be explained by the Austrian theory of the business cycle, namely that monetary expansion prior to the crisis led to a correction.
In fact, you do say that word. You don't believe that the global financial crisis was a crisis of liberal economics in itself, but the mishandling of economics.
Well, I think actually the origins of the crisis were an inability to price risk on the one hand, and then government subsidies on the other hand. But what is interesting is that the remedy for the financial crisis was not Keynesianism, it was Friedmanism. It was Friedman had published his book and argued that the depression in the United States had become a world crisis in 1929 to 1933 because the central bank hadn't provided sufficient liquidity to commercial banks. That was his thesis. And what people learned from it, and what they did in the crisis of 2008 and 9 was to provide sufficient liquidity to banks. They may have gone too far, but the irony is that people think that this is somehow defeat of liberalism, when actually the explanation for the crisis is from Hayek, and the remedy of the crisis is from Friedman.
That may well be so. My question isn't so much about what it was in fact, but that the impression has been given, the zeitgeist, if I could use that language, the liberalism seems to be now much more questioned. Neoliberalism, if there ever was such a thing, is almost always taken as a criticism, and concerns about inequity, growing unequalness, it is believed, is really very serious today. My question is, why was that? Why has liberalism fallen out of favour, even if it shouldn't have?
Well, I think it will never actually be in favor because it goes against strong strengths in human nature. But there was a period, it's quite
Could you explain that further?
Yes,
that last comment first. It goes against strong traits in human nature, liberalism.
Yes, because you have to accept, for example, unequal distribution of income and so on, and you reject the law of the tribe, which is to share all extra income and so on. You allow people to keep for themselves what they create, and this is something that is unpopular with some people. So basically, capitalism has always had to deal with opponents. But for a while, from 1990 to 2008, the socialists they were totally incapacitated by the debacle, by the ruins of Soviet socialism and Chinese communism. So they didn't have any answers, and now they have more or less rejuvenated. So things have returned to normal, which is that capitalism is slandered, is unpopular, but it's still the only game in town. Nobody now believes that we should introduce public ownership of the means of production. No. That's not wrong.
Although the issue seems to have moved from economic to what you may call cultural issues, which is much harder to argue, I think. Yeah. Does that mean that...
That's actually a symbol of how successful capitalism has been, because we can afford to engage in identity politics. It's a kind of a luxury for us to do so, to count how many women and how many blacks are reporters or judges or something like that. This is something that in the past would have been irrelevant, because what we needed then was somebody who was efficient, not whether he was of dark color or the wrong sex or something like that.
So in a way, this cultural issue, which may come or go, I don't know, is itself a sign of the success of the conservative liberal society. That's a fascinating and interesting thought. I suppose the conclusion I'm going to draw is that you've got 24 conservative liberal thinkers, but we're going to need more.
I would agree with you, and we mustn't live in the past, even if we should respect the past. And I think Berg put it wonderfully when he said that the social contract is a partnership between the past, the present, and the future. And the way to bring about this partnership is through private property rights and respect for the family and the civil society and the spontaneous forces of society.
Hannes Gissurarson, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for getting up so early in Iceland to talk to me here in Sydney. Hannes is the author of a number of works, but the one I was basically talking about was a very, very approachable work, quite accessible, called 24 Conservative Liberal Thinkers. It's easy to understand, it's well written, and Hannes puts himself, when he knows the people, in the book as well. And thank you very much indeed. This has been another podcast from the Centre for Independent Studies. For decades, the CIS has been an independent voice working to deliver evidence-based policy within a classical liberal framework. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our cause. Head to cis.org.au to see how you can get involved. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for listening.